Deep Sea Embers Chapter 131 to 140. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. Chapter 131 Inches Breaking Free from the Dream. Duncan watched the nervous hound with a friendly smile. He could tell there was a misunderstanding between himself and the other party. In that case, it was better to resolve this issue as soon as possible. But just before he was about to speak, he suddenly saw the flickering blood light in Dog's eyes. Although he could not see any emotional changes from the bone skull, he seemed to be able to feel the fierce and turbulent mood of this dark hound. In the next second, he heard Dog's stammering voice come out, "You're the, Mr. Duncan we've been dealing with these past 2 days." Duncan was taken aback by the comment since he didn't introduce himself to the hound. Glancing down at Shirley and the chain connecting the pair, he's sure they didn't speak just now. So, that leaves only one answer: they're able to communicate through some sort of information sharing ability. "It's me," Duncan said gently. "Do you need me to explain anything? Or do you have something you want to know?" "No," Dog almost screamed, and his whole body was squirming. "We don't need to know any knowledge or truth. We have no intention of prying into your secrets. I always feel that there is still some misunderstanding between us, but it appears to be getting more difficult to clear things up." Duncan sighed, shaking his head in a helpless manner. "Forget it, let's use time to build up some mutual trust between us. As for now, I have something I want to know." Dog hung his head down. Please speak." Duncan frowned. He was actually very curious as to why his main body, who was famous in the real world, had such a great influence among demons. In his impression, the deep sea was a place that's very close to the subspace. If going by that logic, a shadow demon shouldn't hold such intense fear towards him, the mobile natural disaster of the sea. However, it now seems that the demons, who are themselves dangerous existences to humans, are just as afraid of losing their homeland as humans do, which puzzled him. However, before he figures out this problem, he must first resolve this nightmare inside Shirley's dream world. "I want to know about this dream," Duncan said, his gaze falling on Shirley. "I know it's a painful memory for you, and if you don't want to say it, you can refuse." "There's nothing I don't want to say." Shirley just shook her head slightly. "I should thank you. If you hadn't interrupted this nightmare, I would have kept suffering. As you can see, that's what I went through 11 years ago." Ads by PubFuture. Fire Duncan nodded, then shifted his attention back to Dog. "What I saw was your first encounter with Shirley, right?" Dog flinched sideways to avoid contact. "I was just a common shadow demon at the time." "Then how did you suddenly gain a heart?" Duncan asked curiously. "As far as I can tell, you almost killed Shirley back there." "I don't know." Dog fell silent for a few seconds, shaking his ugly skull in a loss. "When I first became self-aware, Shirley was already dying on the ground." Duncan took in a deep breath and deepened his gaze at the hound, then eyed the chain linking the guy with half of Shirley's body. "After that, both of you became fused together." "Sort of," Shirley murmured, hanging her head and hiding the expression under her hair. "Actually, I don't remember exactly what happened during this period. I was only 6 years old at the time, and then I spent a long while afterward just surviving through each day. If you're really curious about how I got into this relationship with a shadow demon who almost killed me, you can grab a psychiatrist and hypnotize me. Maybe. You don't have to." Shirley's words were suddenly interrupted, and then she felt a large palm resting on top of her head. It felt so warm to the touch. "Sorry, I'm not trying to reveal your scars. I just want to know the details from 11 years ago." Duncan gently soothed the girl's head, understanding the question may be unpleasant for the child. "You should know that it wasn't just the sun fragment that appeared 11 years ago, but also countless cultists that ravaged the city. Theoretically, it should have been a member of the Annihilation sect who summoned the Dark Hounds." Shirley raised her head in a daze, only to be brought back to attention by Duncan's continuing deduction. "A demonic creature from the deep sea suddenly acquired its own consciousness, which in itself is a mutation. Have you ever considered this mutation might be the inducement of a certain thing back then?" Shirley blinked, a little slow in grasping the meaning. "The sun fragment? I'm not sure. No one knows what form or power the sun fragments have, but in the teachings propagated by the Suntists are that it doesn't give humanity to other items or things." Duncan shook his head. "So what caused Dog to gain a sense of awareness may be something other than the sun fragment, something else entirely." You mean that there may be more than just the sun fragments that appeared in Plan 11 years ago? Shirley finally woke up from her confused daze, her eyes widening in shock. Just a little theory. Duncan patted Shirley lightly on the shoulder before withdrawing his hand. I always felt that something was wrong with the whole story. A big contradiction in the matter. If the sun fragment is a holy relic pointing to the Suntists, its power should be straightforward according to the descriptions of those lunatics. But the chaos 11 years ago didn't fit into that box. According to the documents leaked by the officials, the cultists they captured included annihilators and enders. Why would members of the other cults get involved if the incident was caused by the Suntists? Ads by PubFuture. Of course, it can also be explained that the power of the sun fragments is so great that even people who do not believe in the sun god are affected, making them go crazy on the same day. But this can't explain the strange phenomenon like dog here. Now, let's go further than that. Looking at it from the above angle, there are too many suspicious points that we've overlooked. This includes the veiled curtain hanging over the fire, and the fact that the memory remained inside you and Nina's mind. How can only a select few remember the weird phenomena in the sixth block? We've always attributed the cause of all things to the sun fragment, but is that really true? Can you honestly believe the sun fragment is that omnipotent? Duncan expressed the doubts in his heart, and some of the doubts actually arose before today's event. However, it was only after seeing the change in Dog from 11 years ago that he's become firmer in his theory. The fire 11 years ago may have been caused by the sun fragment, but there was definitely something else at play in the whole event. Shirley still didn't fully catch onto the whole theory. She was actually not very good at thinking about these complex things. In her stunned state, Dog's voice rang rapidly. Shirley, are you okay? Did he just touch your head to release a curse? Are you still sane? I'm okay, Shirley replied with a whine. Dog, you're too nervous. Nonsense, how can I not be nervous? You had direct contact with a source of corruption that can turn any sane person mad. Dog's mental voice flew into dread. How are you feeling? Shirley thought about it and touched the top of her head unsurely. From as far as she could remember, the last time someone stroked her hair like this was when she was still a child. Back then, her mom used to do this a lot before putting her to bed. It's warm, she spoke softly in a trance. Dog was dumbfounded. Shirley, something is really wrong with your brain now. You shut up. Duncan didn't know what Dog and Shirley were talking about in their internal link, but he had something else he wanted to check out. Glancing up at the dim window with the reddish hue, he asked, what's out there? Shirley didn't react in time and blurted this out. Duncan raised his hand and pointed to the window. Outside the room, what's out there? I don't know, Shirley blinked, suddenly realizing that she's never once stepped outside this room where the nightmare haunted her. I never thought about it. Every time I dream, I am stuck in this room. But now you're free. Duncan walked to the door and swung around. To the girl, his words were no different from a temptation. Don't you want to try, see what's at the edge of your dream? Chapter 132 Inches The Edge of Dreamland. Do you want to take a look at what the edge of your dream looks like? Duncan's words undoubtedly tempted Shirley, yet she couldn't resist. From the deepest part of her heart, she does want to know, which manifested in the form of an irrepressible urge. In this nightmare that has tormented her for 11 years, outside this locked room, on the streets she had not seen for 11 years ago, what exactly awaited her? She subconsciously took a small breath, then turned her sight to the window that was nearby. In the past, all she knew was the hazy darkness shrouding the outside world, but now, she could finally peer into what that chaotic light stood for. Can people really walk around in their dreams? Shirley couldn't help but mutter, I don't know what's out there, could it be nothingness outside? Dreams are a reflection of the human subconscious, and the human subconscious tends to remember some details that even one cannot perceive. Duncan's voice came from the direction of the doorway that had already been pushed open. Maybe you were stuck in this room 11 years ago, but the light, shadow, and sound outside the window were all part of the things you memorized. These details are clues that will allow us to glimpse into what happened. Of course, the decision is up to you. If you refuse, I will not continue to spy on your dreams. I will stay here, and don't worry, as long as I'm around, this nightmare will not continue. You can sleep in peace, and tomorrow there will still be a clear morning. Shirley bit her lips lightly and then seemed to expend tremendous strength to make up her mind. I want to go out and have a look. Okay. Duncan nodded, leaning sideways to make way for the girl. I'm with you. A subspace shadow, a mobile natural disaster, took the initiative to say that he wanted to walk with her. this should have been a terrible invitation, but for some reason, Shirley only felt relief from the words. To her, Duncan represented a warm light that suddenly barged into the endless dark nightmare. It was sort of crazy to think that way, but that's just how it was. The girl was gradually getting accustomed to living with an evil god now. Duncan followed behind Shirley as the two stepped into the living room in Shirley's memory. Dog also followed them from the rear with a rather nervous appearance. He kept watching his surroundings, and he would prick his skull up from time to time like he was searching for any abnormal movement from the streets. Dog, what are you doing? Shirley asks after getting a little confused. Scouting, Dog said in a deep voice, we are entering the unknown zone in the dream, further on is the area that doesn't exist in your memory. In theory, the things in front will become more and more twisted to fit your subconscious imagination and emotions. In the case of fear acting as the dominant emotion, the environment may generate something that's not so friendly. Shirley was amazed. Dog, you actually know so much. Ads by PubFuture. Only a little bit. The dark hound cheekily raised his skull high. I'm also a proper shadow demon. Duncan didn't care about the conversation the pair was having mentally. Instead, he was watching for any clues in the living room. A kind of chaotic darkness had enveloped this slightly shabby living room from what he could perceive. Nevertheless, he could still see the shelf placed against the wall, a table and few chairs in the middle, and a clock hanging with its dial unmoving. Everything appeared to be in order, except for the deep claw mark on the floorboard. That's the mark left behind when Dog broke inside the home. In addition, there was no blood, no corpse, no scorch marks in the living room. The fire seemed to be confined to the streets outside, or simply because in Shirley's subconscious mind, the fire never spread into the home. They walked through the place and eventually came to the front door where there's a huge hole through the middle segment. Aside from the door frame and a few loosely hanging pieces of wood, the entire thing had been smashed apart. Further out, there are streets currently engulfed in fire. Shirley stopped here. The girl didn't realize it before, but she's truly afraid of going into the streets where it's burning. Shirley. Dog glanced up at his partner with concern. Shirley tightly bit her lips as if she didn't hear Dog's voice. She was having second thoughts, and her mind had started to wonder what might have happened to her parents that night. They also stepped through the front entrance here, and afterward, they never came home. But then the soft clatter of chains brought the girl back to attention. It was Dog taking the initiative to walk outside, slightly tugging at the girl to join and break her trance. Shirley, it's okay. There's nothing scary outside, and if there is, I can't tell. Shirley looked at the hollow eyes of the dark hound with some surprise. Then pursing her lips, thank you. Then she stepped out with her feet after so many years of being confined. The streets are still filled with a thin layer of misty smoke, so it was quite difficult to get the full picture of the carnage. Even so, the thin, darkishly red fuzz in the distances told them the houses and street lamps were still there, but burning. Duncan frowned at this view. The fires on the street they're walking on had already been extinguished, leaving only traces of the flames behind in the form of shapeless ashes and molten metal in the corners. All of this pointed to a huge tragedy, but he couldn't find any signs pointing this to the sun fragment. But on second thought, this seems normal. After all, this was just Shirley's dream, a stage woven by her memory and emotions, so it's not genuinely bringing back everything from 11 years. With this understanding in mind, he followed Shirley slowly through the streets that had been burned by the fire. Ads by PubFuture. Suddenly, his footsteps halted. Mr. Duncan. Shirley looked back in surprise. Duncan frowned and waved his hand to silence the other two while focusing his ears on movement sounds. Just now, his ears definitely picked up something, a faint voice crying out somewhere. After carefully keeping still and listening, he eventually pinpointed the source to a pile of ash by the roadside. It was a twisted pile of black ash mixed with some charred black fragments. It appears whatever, or whoever this was, they've died and left nothing behind. There was even an ember still burning next to the ash. If observed long enough, one could even partially make out the shape of the individual who died here by the way it's curled up. Duncan stared at the ash for the longest time until he slowly bent down to investigate. I don't want to die, the cloud of ash murmurs. Duncan popped his eyes, while Shirley on the other hand blasted her true thoughts out. What is this 4x thing? Duncan swung his head back immediately, causing the gothic girl to quickly adjust her wording again. I mean this is terrible. I prefer the straightforwardness you showed just now. The corners of Duncan's mouth twitched as he said this. In fact, He was also frightened silly by the murmuring from the ashes here, but that got entirely overshadowed by Shirley's outcry. I don't want to die. Help. Go home. Who will help? A creepy numbness had started to spread across the girl's heart, causing Shirley to clutch her hands against the hem of the dress. Despite having the courage to fight with a dark hound in hand, the girl clearly lacked resistance to these purely weird occult evils. But at this moment, the surprise quickly turned to confusion. Is this really her own nightmare? In this edge of dreams that has long drifted beyond her own memory and recognition, these cries for help shouldn't be here. It shouldn't be possible if she never came into contact with such a thing back then. Shirley subconsciously looked to Duncan for the answer but saw that the latter was also looking her way with a scrutinizing gaze. It may not be just a dream, the man said in a deep voice. Chapter 133 Inches the Strange Shadow. To be fair, Duncan wasn't an expert in the supernatural field and lacked knowledge of the subjects related to dreams, but he still vaguely judged that the scenery presented on this street shouldn't be normal inside Shirley's mind. Why? Because the ashes that murmured for help gave him a wonderful sense of déjà vu of what he saw in the factory and those piles of ashes hidden behind the veiled curtain. Of course, the ashes in the factory did not call out for help. The ashes gave him a more intuitive and stronger signal, allowing him to see firsthand the echoes of the fire 11 years ago. Subconsciously, Duncan believes that the ashes here in Shirley's dream and the factory are somehow connected. Raising his head, he scanned the surrounding environment covered by the fire's dim red light. There were countless piles of ashes strewn across various places, falling sparks, dust debris, and imprinted shadows of those who once walked these supposed streets, a tragic scene. You were only 6 years old back then. No matter how many things you subconsciously observed, it probably wasn't enough to support such a huge dream. On top of that, I do not believe such a young mind can create illusions like these weird ashes calling for help. Duncan said softly, his voice calming the girl's unsettled nerves. To be honest, the ghostly captain still gave a frightening and intimidating impression to Shirley, but in this nightmare, that's growing increasingly freakier by the second, the man was the only reassurance she had to rely upon. Let's keep going forward and see where the scope of this dream lies. Shirley was hesitant to agree but promptly dragged Dog along after noticing the ghost captain already moving forward. Amidst the murmuring cries for help from the countless piles of ashes, the two of them and a dog continued to walk through the embering streets. Duncan made sure to take in every change he noticed, but to his surprise, the streets were unusually safe and calm aside from the ominous vibe. Then Duncan suddenly jerked to a halt, his brows furrowing slightly at realizing something. Ads by PubFuture. Mr. Duncan. Shirley cast a curious gaze. Did you find anything again? How far have we been walking from the point of origin? Duncan looked up and down the embering street. To him, the houses and buildings all looked no different from a hazy blur of red due to the buildings still smoldering in the distance. Point of origin. Shirley showed a confused face. Oh, you mean the room where we started? Should be. It's already quite far, at least half a block away by now. Surely, the situation is not right. At this point, even Dog had realized the weirdness and nervously eyed the reddish haze around them with wariness. Let's stop for a moment. Still not picking up on the freakiness of the situation, Shirley shot the man and hound a strange look. What's wrong? Can you two tell me first? Dreams are centered around the cognitive perception of the dreamer. Your basis is that bedroom from your childhood memory. Dog explained swiftly and to the point. Going by that logic, the area outside of the room is no more than supporting supplement for your dream. The farther we get away from the center, the more absurd and twisted everything should become. I wouldn't even be surprised if a cliff suddenly appeared in front of our feet. Yet, we've come this far without incident. Duncan faintly nodded in agreement. His theory was pretty much in the same league as Dog here. Shirley finally woke up and gasped. So, where are we now? Is this still my dream? No one could answer Shirley's question, and Duncan could only watch the surrounding smoldering structures with thought. Everywhere he could see, there were burnt buildings and scorched roads. The urban area after the fire was like an ugly scar, deeply ingrained onto the body of the city and extending out to parts beyond their visual perception. At this rate, who knows how many more of the city was affected. He then turned to face another direction. From what he could tell, there were some tall buildings near their location. It's a distillation tower of one of the factories. It pierced straight into the sky amidst the smoke and dust and had countless coiled pipes snaking around the skeletal structure that remained after the flames. To describe the current picture, it's like a strange mountain that's been carved out. Duncan involuntarily stared at the tall distillation tower, thinking that if he stood on that tip, he might be able to overlook the entire fire scene. Then his eyes froze. The scene that Nina once described to him, it's suddenly starting to match up. A very high place overlooking the city after the fire, the streets scarred by the heat running through the entire city-state. That's what Nina saw in her dreams, just from a different perspective. Ads by PubFuture. He promptly turned his head to face Shirley due to this astonishing discovery. We may have entered another dream. Another dream. Shirley popped her eyes in shock. Whose dream? Nina's. Follow me, Duncan said briefly, and then took off for the distillation tower. He did not summon I to spirit walk over in this dream world because he didn't know if the bird could even come inside this weird place. Secondly, he needed I to keep tabs on the outside if something dangerous decides to make a home visit. Luckily, the distillation tower wasn't far from where they were, only a few alleys and 2 streets away. Shirley didn't understand why the ghost captain would suddenly bolt for a place that they had no clue if it was safe or not, but if this was Nina's dream like Mr. Duncan said, then it would not be wrong. If anything, they might even find Nina there. However, Duncan didn't find anything like he thought after arriving at the factory site. This left him doubting his own deduction until he got a strange notion of being watched. Swinging his head around to seek the source of this discomfort, that's when he saw it. A tall and thin figure wearing a black trench coat with a large black umbrella in hand. There's someone over there, Shirley exclaims after catching up. Do you see it too? Duncan subconsciously asked, only to be interrupted by a weird and harsh sound from the weirdo. It wasn't any language Duncan knew of. In fact, the overly complex and overlapping echoes in the voice made him suspect that it wasn't a language at all, but rather an animalistic growl. The weirdo with the umbrella also seemed surprised at the uninvited guests wandering about. After the initial pause, the strange figure suddenly made a move. Duncan couldn't see what the other party had done precisely in that second, but the afterglow from the corner of his eye keenly caught the slithering of several black shadows coming out from beneath the hem of that trench coat. Those pure shadows swam across the walls and streets. Eventually, even the weirdo had disappeared from thin air. In the next second, before Duncan could react, the black figure had teleported right beside Shirley. Thankfully, Shirley had never once relaxed her muscles since entering this dream world. As fast as the umbrella weirdo moved back there, the gothic girl and her partner had already reunited and ready to strike down with the meteor hammer of doggy death. Screw this, she yelled with a hint of excitement at finally being able to vent the nerves, which showed in the way she swung that doggy chain around like a barbaric weapon. Chapter 134 Inches Feast in Fire. Shirley's fighting style was the same as always, simple, crude, and effective, with a sense of freedom. She's truly wielding dog like no equal. The strange figure who jumped through the shadow didn't seem to have expected the summoner girl, with a shadow demon was essentially a melee combatant. According to normal logic, it's safe to assume a spell-casting profession disliked close-quarter fighting and would do everything to keep their distance. However, the result was the opposite, with the caster taking out a meteor hammer for the brawl. The chain creaked as Shirley smashed down with dog, and the black shadow was hit solidly on the spot. With a loud bang, as it whistled out in a somersault, the shadow eventually crashed into a nearby burning building and caused a large plume of smoke and ember to rise from the impact. That's it. The smooth progress of the battle was unexpected to the point that even Shirley herself didn't know how to take it. Nevertheless, she kept dog close in one hand with a constant guard up. Why do I feel like? But before her sentence could finish, dog's exclaiming warning had come from the other end of the chain. Watch out. Shirley's muscles strained with stress, and in the next second, she finally noticed that the shadow under her feet had become a little viscous looking. But before she could take evasive maneuver, a blurry whip had ejected from the shadow beneath her leg. The attack came straight for the girl's neck with a lethal slicing sound. Fortunately, the latter was barely able to keep herself from being beheaded. Even so, she still got nacked on the arm, causing a huge splatter of blood to spray from the gaping wound. Shirley huffed a grunt and retreated without caring for the pain. Only then did she notice that part of her own shadow didn't move, remaining in the same spot where she once stood. This shocked the girl, of course, but then it soon dawned on her why as the umbrella man creepily emerged from the ground. To say she's disgusted was an understatement. Not only did she suffer an injury at the hand of the other party, but the very black whip that sliced her arm was in fact a grotesque tentacle squirming out from the hem of the other party's coat. To think something from a monster like that actually touched her was enough to make Shirley puke. Without giving any time for questioning, the umbrella man issues out a low and vague howl before launching himself at the target again. This time, there were multiple black tentacles firing out in multiple angles like an octopus. Ads by PubFuture. Subconsciously, Shirley lifted the chain in her hand to defend herself, only to be distracted by a beam of green flame that shot over from the side of her peripheral vision. At the same time, the umbrella man suddenly froze in that split second, remaining in place using that pouncing posture of a predator as if gripped by fear itself. Then without delay, the shadowy figure suddenly leapt backward. It retreated under a surge of black miasma coming out of the umbrella. The creature roared and howled in anger, but the green flame didn't relent and continued to pursue. It had a homing feature, and whatever the ghostly flame touched, it burned with a ferocity that not even the dark miasma could contend with. This caused Shirley to glance in the direction of the source, which she saw Duncan standing there quietly like an actual ghost. However, she couldn't say the same lack of emotions was happening in the surrounding environments. Everything in sight, with the man as the epicenter, the buildings and streets were giving off a ghostly green glow like they were being overtaken. What's the word? Infected. Yes, the dream world was being infected. This is the power of this big boss. Or is it just the tip of the iceberg of his power? Shirley exclaimed inside, shocked by how incredible Duncan's powers were. However, she didn't have time to dwell on the matter because the attacker who quickly retreated had obviously been suppressed and deterred. Knowing this was her chance, she lopped Dog out with the greatest strength she could muster in those petite arms. She landed a hit on the first try. The umbrella man had clearly grown sluggish at whatever powers hindering its movement. Yet, the girl didn't feel any cheeriness from making an impact. The reason? It felt like hitting a mass of rotten flesh. At least that's what Dog's mental feedback was telling her. Then in the next moment, perhaps it had finally lost its temper from Shirley's interference, the umbrella man suddenly tore its own limbs apart like a glob of slime. It was an absolutely terrifying and bizarre scene. The scorched and twisted alien limbs were squirming about, splitting, and fleeing in every direction of the streets where the embers had not burned. The shouts that seemed to pierce mortal sanity rose and fell one after the other until the splitting and dissemination melded the creature into the very dream world. Shirley got creeped out to the core for sure. She gripped the chain in her hand with even more strength, not knowing what tactic this creature might use by melding into the environment. However, she soon noticed something odd: the pieces of flesh didn't continue the fight. They were swarming away to evade Duncan's ever-spreading flame. It's like watching a colony of roaches fleeing across a dumpster pile on the street. The flames were the pesticide, and the lumps of bloodied flesh were the pests being killed. Of course, some of the lumps did get ahead of Duncan's attack, allowing them to flee into the neighboring streets and buildings. Nevertheless, the lumps that were captured by the green pyre were promptly enveloped by the ghost fire and consumed. Everything happened so quickly that Shirley barely managed to catch the initial carnage. At first she assumed the flames would incinerate the lumps of flesh, but turns out it wasn't, it's corrupting some of them. About a minute or two. That's how long the open zombie banquet lasted as the lumps of flesh turned on their former compatriots and started gnawing at each other. It didn't help either when Duncan decided to up the game by creating a wall of flame around the area after optimizing his hunting ground. It's either they died by cannibalism or died by running into the wall of flame. Don't be afraid, Duncan soothed Shirley after noticing the shivering girl. Bugs are most afraid of fire. Ads by PubFuture. Shirley's shoulders shook some more, yet there was a strange feeling of peace and calm in her heart after hearing that remark. But I do agree, it is a little disgusting. Duncan didn't bother to hide his displeasure at the weird crunching sound that just hit them from a crumbled building. I didn't expect things to turn out like this. Who are you trying to kid? Indeed, Shirley said forcefully despite crying foul inside, it is a little disgusting. Fortunately, it's almost over, Duncan said in a slightly relaxed tone. As the ghost captain said, the sound of flames and predation gradually subsided, with both predator and prey eventually exhausting their vitality. What remained were piles of ashes scattered about in the breeze, the substance the result of certain creatures being burned alive. Gulping at realizing this fact, Shirley took a step back to avoid getting some of the dust on herself. Is it over? Duncan shook his head. Not necessarily. Shirley looked at Duncan in surprise and confusion but then saw the other party walking forward towards the last blob of the attacker in a nearby corner. The abomination squirmed shakily, seemingly wanting to escape to only stop after Duncan blocked its path with a spark of ethereal green. I've heard a lot of scary and bizarre stories in my past, and those stories have taught me an important lesson, Duncan said slowly so Shirley could follow. If you suddenly find that your enemy has the ability to splinter off into smaller pieces, then you'd better assume that the first enemy you encounter is just another splinter of the original. This way, the crappy author will have an excuse to write a sequel to the first book. With a tap of his fingertips, he lit the last blob aflame. I don't like sequels very much because I hate knowing masterminds are lurking in the shadows and controlling the scenes. The trope is always the same, with the protagonists being tricked and then stabbed in the back. The green flame violently crackled there. Like an insect being burned alive, the blob of flesh squealed in agony until the flame suddenly dispersed and left the thing staggering to upright itself. The way it's swaying, it's exactly like those zombies in a horror flick. Pleased by what he's done, Duncan slowly stood back and quietly stared at the last remaining piece of the attacker. Go home and bring my gift to your master. Chapter 135 inches the end of the dreamland. The fire-contaminated lump trembled and climbed up, then crawled faster and faster until it went off to the end of the street. It's there that it disappeared in a puff of smoke like it had entered some sort of portal. This mass of flesh and blood, which has stopped thinking, has embarked on its way home. Whether it could really return to some body, or whether it would exhaust its vitality and dissipate halfway there, that's not coming Duncan could control. Heck, it might even be intercepted and purified by something along the way as well. Nothing was certain in life. All he could do was take precautions to remove the hidden danger within the scope of his ability. When Shirley fought the weird shadow back there, he had been analyzing the origin of the assailant who appeared in the nightmare. It's the reason he shot the fireball at the other party, a test, and an experiment. The result was that the thing was no more than a splintered off Pathfinder. That's right, the umbrella man they fought was no more than a scout in his opinion. Duncan looked thoughtfully at the direction in which the clump of flesh disappeared. Not only was the attacker who suddenly appeared more familiar with this dream than himself and Shirley, but they also had a more convenient means of traveling through the spaces. It's also the reason the umbrella man managed to close the distance without Duncan noticing beforehand. In contrast, he and first-time explorers, like Shirley and Dog, are like headless flies in the dreams here. Tracing someone lurking in the shadow would be difficult under these circumstances. But it didn't matter. The fire had begun to spread under his will. Through the faint connection looming over his perception, Duncan believes that the flames will eventually return with some gains until he finds the hidden lurker. By that point, Nina and Shirley would be ridden of these nightmares. Mr. Duncan, Shirley looked at Duncan, who had gotten quiet again, with a slightly scared face. You know what that is just now? She was referring to the attacker with the black umbrella. Duncan thought for a moment and shook his head. Then he suddenly recalled something after watching the burning streets. No, but do you remember the person I mentioned standing on the edge of the museum square? The one that only you can see. Shirley immediately recalled. Ah, the one that attacked us just now is the one you saw. I'm not sure it's the same. Duncan unsurely shook his head, but it's certainly the same species. I suspect it's related to the cultists who believe in the sun god, since both times are related to a fire. That alone is suspicious. It's related to those cultists. Shirley blinked and quickly realized, could it be the sun air mentioned by those cultists? Ads by PubFuture. Although there is no evidence, let's assume that for now. Duncan exhaled softly, but compared to the attacker's identity, I care more about why it's inside yours and Nina's dream. What is the connection between the museum site and your dreams? As he spoke, he swept his gaze over to the tall water tower. Nina was still not visible at the top, but Duncan was almost certain that it had to be the tall structure in Nina's dream. This is really Nina's dream. Shirley also looked around curiously, her face full of disbelief. How do you know? She mentioned this dream to me before, and in the dream, she was standing on the tallest distillation tower overlooking the burnt city, Duncan said while pointing to the nearby tower. This location is about 2 blocks away from the hut in your nightmare. Although I don't know the reason, your dreams are obviously connected to each other on a deeper level. Shirley was surprised but still wanted to ask something. However, right as she was about to do so, Dog found something and cried out, "Hey Shirley, look over there. The umbrella that guy was holding is still over there." Shirley and Duncan snapped their heads over to the pointed location, and sure enough, a large black umbrella was quietly lying on the side of the street. Their attention was so focused on the attacker that they ignored this fact. Duncan quickly walked over and examined the item up close. After seeing the inner makings of the umbrella, he couldn't help but make a gawking sound of a huh with his mouth. He had imagined what the umbrella might look like after being wielded by the attacker. It could be a supernatural item with grotesque makeup as well, or it could be a cursed object with terrifying abilities, but under no circumstances did he expect something in this direction. The layout was an extremely complex arrangement of hexagonal lattices. Like a solar panel, it's a device of extremely fine calibration. Then looking at the center skeletal handle, it's something he only ever sees in a sci-fi movie. It's far more complex and high-tech than anything a steam engine could ever compete against. To say it's space-level technology was no understatement. Duncan stared at the thing dumbfoundedly. This came from a civilization that is incomprehensible to modern society. What is this? Shirley looked at the inner structure of the umbrella in astonishment and confusion. She couldn't understand what it was at all, and she lacked Duncan's cognition from another world. She only felt that this thing was 100 times more complicated than she imagined and became a little dazzled. She stretched out her hand subconsciously. It looks like. Don't touch. Dog yelped with urgency and interrupted Shirley. This looks like some kind of blasphemous prototype. Ads by PubFuture. Shirley looked stunned. Blasphemy prototype. What the heck is that? Some kind of forbidden historical creation that shouldn't appear but was forcibly stranded in the real world, Dog solemnly whispered. I don't know how to explain it to you, because I don't know what the principle behind this is either. Anyway, you only need to remember that some parts of the history in this world are locked, and the things behind it are all taboos. This item is one of those taboos. Its very existence is harmful to those living in the real world, so don't touch it. Shirley shrunk her hands back with the rigidity of a robot. Is this also the inherent knowledge of a shadow demon? Duncan asks thoughtfully. Sort of. Dog shook his head. Not all shadow demons know this, but I was born closer to the head of the Ether Lord, hence the reason why I have more knowledge in my head. Duncan snorted noncommittally, his gaze resting on the strange black umbrella. As if due to the loss of some kind of support, the umbrella had began to disintegrate and collapse rapidly before his very eyes. The delicate lattice structure gradually became transparent, the skeleton and wiring faded and turned into grayish debris under the breeze, and the complex device acting as the core also melted down like heated wax. But before the thing wholly melted away, the corner of Duncan's eye had noticed a few words printed on a certain part. It wasn't the common words used by modern society, nor the other languages he was familiar with, but the meaning of the text still came to mind. K22 spectral filtering nuclei. In the next second, the entire umbrella had crumbled into dust, blowing off into nothingness. Ah, what is my hand? Shirley suddenly exclaims from the side right when the man got back up. Duncan looked at Shirley's arm and found that not only the arm but even the entire body was gradually becoming transparent and blurred. Shirley flew into a panic. Hell help. Save your butt. Dog directly cuts off the screaming girl. You're waking up soon. The first time you ever woke up normally from this dream. Hurry and thank Mr. Duncan for that. Shirley blinked and quickly got it. Facing the ghost captain, she saw that the other person was also starting to fade from the dream. Duncan smiled and waved his hand at the girl in front of him. Good night and good morning. Don't forget to wake up Nina for breakfast later. Chapter 136 Inches An ordinary morning in the antique store. As the morning ray gradually illuminated the slumbering giant that was planned, those who hid in their homes for the night finally began to stir. Shirley shot open her eyes as soon as she came to. In front were an unfamiliar ceiling, a clean window with light shining through, and a low cabinet next to the bed. Everything was so tidy and cozy that it gave her a sense of surrealness. She tried to remember what was going on, but the faint aroma of food suddenly hit her nose and caused the girl to freeze. It was coming from the direction of the kitchen. Finally, it clicked in her brain and part of what happened yesterday quickly returned. Looking around, the Gothic girl saw Nina soundly asleep in a weird, awkward position. Normally, it's only proper to wake the friend up, which she did so by stirring the slumbering maiden. Nina, get up, it's time for breakfast. Nina responded groggily. I'm still sleepy, just a little longer. Shirley appeared taken aback by the answer and didn't know how to respond. It's been many years since someone said something like that to her. As a result, it didn't click with the orphaned girl that it's possible to sleep in and not get out of bed when the sun rises. Out of habit, she slowly climbed out of bed first, then changed into her own clothes while listening to the various movements outside. Make no mistake, Shirley hadn't forgotten this was a nest of some subspace shadow and his kin. It may look homely, feel warm, and smell oh so good to the nose right now, but it couldn't be real. Yet, she also couldn't deny it felt more like a home to her than the one she and Dog lived in. Exactly then, while Shirley was a little distracted, Nina had jerked awake like a clock and crankily cried out, "Ah!" It's already so late. Swinging her head around after being caught off guard, Shirley watched in awe at how robotic Nina moved. First, the latter glanced at the bright window to confirm the hour, then turned back to ask the standing girl in confusion, Shirley. How did you? Oh right, you stayed overnight. Ah, I need to make breakfast. But just as quickly as she awoke, Nina suddenly stopped partway through in removing the blanket when she smelled the aroma of food from the kitchen. Oh, Uncle is making breakfast today. Oh right, Uncle has been in good health recently. Ah no. School. I'm going to be late for school. Then before she could finish her antics, Nina rushed to her desk and packed her things up for the trip. However, as she did before, Nina jerked to a halt and glanced at the calendar hanging beside the bed. Oh right, it's a day off today. Without missing a beat, the innocent young maiden spun around and plopped her head right back into the pillow, this time not even bothering to curl back into the blanket this time. Just 2 more minutes, 2 more. Shirley watched the whole scene in silence, overwhelmed by the dazzling comedic operation of someone so innocent. From her view, only a sheltered individual could possibly produce such a habit, otherwise, they wouldn't survive out in the wild. But then as quickly as she assumed Nina wouldn't pounce up again, the slumbering maiden did it again. Ah, I'm awake. Shirley. Ads by PubFuture. Shirley, what's the manner? Nina turned her head and looked at Shirley energetically. Why are you making that face? Shirley. Do you do this every morning when you're waking up? Nina got all confused. Huh. What you mean? It's just. Shirley gestured around frantically as if the act would help her get the idea through. You jumped up first, then this, then that, then back again. Oh, that's because I'm still in a daze when I first wake up in the morning. Nina somehow magically read through the exaggerated body language and nodded vehemently, but I'm fully awake now. Oh right, did you sleep well last night? I'm usually a rowdy sleeper, did I disturb you? As soon as Shirley was about to speak, a series of memories suddenly came to her. It's about the sealed cabin from her childhood, the sound of a dark hound breaking in, and of the incredible adventure she had while exploring the dream world. A little weird, a little scary, but also pretty awesome. I slept well. Shirley laughed a little. Actually, I'm a rowdy sleeper too. Dog always said that I will one day tear my bed upside down. Uncle used to say that about me too. Nina swiftly changed into her day clothes and led her friend out of the room with a yawn. Let's go eat first, I'm a little hungry. As hesitant as she was, Shirley got dragged out the door in confusion and finally met with Duncan inside the small kitchen. The man was wiping down the table in an apron, which gave quite a refreshing look to the ghost captain. Mr. Duncan. Shirley once again grew a little nervous. Although she saw it with her own eyes of how the man saved her in that dream world, it was still difficult to remain calm. Hanging her head while trying to suppress the tension in her muscles, good morning. Just like the big boss ordered, treat this place as an ordinary home and behave like a normal guest. What are we eating, Uncle? Nina was already walking towards the kitchen table with a drooling face. It smells so good. I fried some sausages that I bought yesterday, Duncan said casually, then pressed Nina's head to turn her around for the bathroom. First wash your face and hands. Immediately after that, he turned to face Shirley and stabbed his waist like a nanny. You too, Shirley. Don't stand there in a daze. Hurry and wash up for breakfast. Shirley froze like a clueless doll but quickly followed Nina's footsteps for the morning ritual. After returning by herself first, the gothic girl even made sure to spread her hands out as evidence. I washed them. After saying that, the girl instantly flushed up with embarrassment due to how silly the gesture was. As a person that's about to become a full-fledged adult, her behavior was no different than that of a little child being lectured by a parent. Something must have broken inside that brain of hers last night, otherwise she wouldn't have done this. Shirley was sure of that. But Duncan didn't care and just nodded. Then walking back to the stovetop, he casually asked, how did you sleep? Shirley lowered her head again. It's okay, better than before. Ads by PubFuture. Did the injuries in the dream affect reality? Duncan asked again. Shirley was stunned, but then quickly understood the meaning behind it. The whiplash from the umbrella monster left quite the impression, which she checked by raising her left arm with a faint scar. Due to the strong self-healing ability, the scar had almost healed by this time. It didn't hurt or tingle in the slightest, but there's no doubt the injury from the dream world had crossed over. Duncan didn't miss this, of course. Once he confirmed there was indeed a mark on Shirley's arm, his gaze deepened with a glint of severity. An abnormal phenomenon, but not beyond expectations. That weird dream is not just any dream. It seems my speculation is right. If you're injured in that dream, it will also affect your real body outside. Duncan deepened his voice to get the point through. In the future, do not explore that world on your own without me. Your combat power is strong but ineffective against that splintering monster. Shirley quickly nodded. I got it. Duncan then added after a brief thought, also, if you're stuck in that nightmare again, you can call me directly. Shirley froze for a moment as if unable to process the message. Call you. Call my name, Duncan said lightly, or call the vanished, preferably next to a medium with reflecting properties like glass or mirror. I can hear you better that way. Are you intending to make me your kin? She raised her eyes and asked nervously after getting an alarming cry from Dog through the connection they shared. I don't know what kin you are referring to, nor do I intend to offer such a request. However, you are Nina's friend and acting alongside me now, so this is my way of looking out for you. Shirley took a breath but did not dare to answer rashly. Exactly then, Nina's cheerful voice had come through the kitchen door. What are you two talking about? You don't have to answer me now, Duncan whispered to Shirley, then glanced up at Nina. How come it took you so long to wash up? I couldn't get the eye poop out of the corner of my eye. Nina rubbed her eyes. It hurts a little. Drink more water in the following days. Duncan spread his hands helplessly at the girl's antics. By the way, did you happen to dream again last night? The one where you're overlooking the fire at night? No, Nina thought for a moment and shook her head, but I did dream about my tummy getting pressed by a horse, then a cow. How come you're asking me this, uncle? Nothing much. I'm only asking because the psychiatrist is coming to visit today. Duncan shook his head, putting away his thoughts for now. Let's eat. Chapter 137 Inches to Descendants. From the city-states of Pland and Lanza to the north, crossing the busy, Great Cross route of trading merchants, the frosted weather was eternally entrenched over this mass of water known as the Cold Sea. As a result, these parts presented a different set of challenges compared to the warmer climates in the south. Here, fine ice constantly drifted between the current lines, and large icebergs often rose from beneath the depths without warning. This not only created a danger for unsuspecting ships, but also created a barrier for the seafaring ships that's trying to cross the islands. But compared to the large iceberg that's controlled by the laws of nature and the visions that only exist in legends, the captains who make a living in the cold sea had something far more dangerous whom they feared. Who was it? The name was Tyrion Abnomar, the infamous son of Duncan Abnomar and pirate captain of the undead fleet roaming these waters. They've been raiding the trading routes here for the past half-century and would continue to do so in the eyes of those sailors. On the edge of an island blocked by special currents and fogs, a steel warship with iron-gray paint, rigid lines, and a towering bow was quietly moored in the dock. Right now, suppliers and sailors are busy adding fuel and replenishing the supplies on board. If anyone standing here had even the slightest knowledge of the history regarding the Frost City state, they would surely notice the naval uniforms worn by the sailors are not right, the designs are from half a century ago. In addition, they're also wearing white emblems on the chest, a tradition that's only used when there's mourning. In the captain's room on the upper floor of the metal battleship, a man in black naval overcoat was currently flipping through a document in his hand. The guy was tall and thin, with a towering nose and deep eye sockets. Yet, despite the unhealthy appearance, he's well kept aside from the eye patch on the left eye, his signature piece of paradehood. At the same time, a large parrot with colorful tail feathers rested on a nearby wooden frame, staring intently at the brass device beside the emaciated man, a complex set of lenses surrounded by a circle of rocker arms and small lenses. The center was a large crystal ball, which looked luxurious and mysterious. Pearly, if you touch it, I will send you to the Bright Star next month to accompany those puppets and ghosts next month. The emaciated man said without lifting his head. Ah, cruelty. The large parrot immediately cawed, shaking the wooden frame like a child. Ah, cruel. What a cruel Captain Tyrion is. I should have asked which bastard taught you this. Tyrion Abnomar frowned. Can't you say something else? The large parrot flapped its wings triumphantly. Pearly learned it himself. Pearly learned it himself. Tyrion rubbed his vexed temple. Damn it, and that sentence too. Exactly then, a knock on the door interrupted the antics of the pair. Ads by PubFuture. Come in. Tyrion turned his head and spoke. The door to the captain's compartment opened, and a tall, bald man rigidly strolled in. His skin was pale, like a long-dead corpse, and his eyes were encircled with an eternal cloudy haze. Even from the side, a faint smell of the sea permeated his body like it's been soaking in a watery grave for years. A moving corpse, a dead body stranded in the living world. Tyrion looked at the living dead, who walked into the room. Aiden, how much fuel did we get so far? We're about full, Captain. The tall, bald man known as Aiden lowered his head slightly, his voice hoarse and rough like a zombie. The boiler is already warming up. Very good. Tyrion nodded in satisfaction. And is there any movement at Cold Port? Quiet as a stone, Aiden said with a hint of contempt in his tone. They dare not offend our territory. Even if only half of the Sea Mist fleet remained in the cold sea, those cowards would not have the courage to trespass our route. They're smart and good at calculating the trade-offs between interests. They've been like that since we started raiding their ships. Tyrion laughed with disdain. Go and prepare, we're departing at the arranged time. Yes, Captain. The first mate, who exuded the aura of the dead, pushed open the door and left the captain's sight. Tyrion's first mate was a living dead. In fact, all members of the Sea Mist fleet are aside from himself. But in a sense, he too was no different from the dead, a man cursed by the powers of subspace and continued to live to this date. Thankfully he had his loyal crewmates with him for the past half-century, making the ordeal not so lonely in these times. Tyrion quickly shook off the weird sentimental thoughts after realizing he's fallen into a daze. At the same time, the brass device next to him suddenly clicked with a mechanical sound, followed by the movement of the rocker arms and lenses spinning rapidly. Soon, the crystal ball in the center began to emit a faint glow, revealing a blurry image from the globe. A young lady with long black hair appeared. She wore a silky black dress and gave off a mysterious air that one would assume to be a witch. Lucretia. Tyrion glanced at the lady in the crystal ball and nodded slightly. I didn't expect you to remember. How nice of you to send a greeting before your brother sets out on an expedition. The young lady in the crystal ball was about to speak, but after hearing Tyrion's words, she immediately showed a surprised face. You're leaving today? Tyrion frowned. Aren't you here to send me off today? Ads by PubFuture. No. The mage-like mysterious lady shook her head calmly. My deep-sea detection device exploded. The corners of Tyrion's mouth visibly twitched, and then he heard his sister continue. Everything else is easy to repair, but I can't find a crystal lens to replace the core. Tyrion continued to be deadpan at her sister's rambling. Do you have a new one over on your side? I'll trade you one with a mineral sample from the border. Only 2 city-states can produce spirit lenses that meet your accuracy requirements, and the main trading channels are controlled by the Truth Academy. You know full well how little and limited those are in circulation. Tyrion finally couldn't help but sigh. It's only been 2 months since you last broke your detection device. I found a very interesting sample, probably floated up from the deep sea, Lucretia said. Samples from the deep sea aren't good enough. Although those things can be sold to the Truth Academy for a high price. I also collected some phantoms left behind after a border collapse. This is not. Tyrion covered his head due to the headache. The main thing is I really don't know where to get you a new set of lenses now. Lucretia thought for a moment. How about robbery? I can't always rely on robbery, Tyrion sighed, and the Sea Mist fleet is preparing its transition to normalized operations. Our main income now is based on protection fees. Oh, forget it. Lucretia finally shrugged like she didn't care anymore. However, her latter half of the sentence instantly sent the infamous pirate up the walls. Then I'll ask again tomorrow. You, forget it. I know I can't stop your exploration plans. Tyrion finally deflated and sighed helplessly. He really didn't know how much he had already sighed in these few short minutes. Tell me about you, my respectable, great explorer sister. Have you been wandering the frontiers of the civilized world again? How goes the search for signs of our world coming to an end? I can hear your teasing, brother, Lucretia said expressionlessly. You've always been dismissive of my sense of urgency and never even really cared for the things I find at the border. However, I can understand that you like to focus on more practical things, so I'm even more grateful for the help you've given me. But don't forget, our father, the warning he made back then. Our world is just a pile of extinguishing embers. Tyrion leaned back in his chair and murmured as if sighing. I still don't know exactly what he saw that day, but it's an obvious fact that he was crazy when he made that warning. What you're doing now is no different from following in his path. Even if you try harder, the truth that you uncover will only drive you mad as it did to him. Tyrion shook his head and looked squarely at the figure in the crystal ball. Lucretia, it's bad enough to have one vanished in this world. I do not wish to see a second. Chapter 138 Inches the Bright Star. So it's bad enough to have one vanished in this world. Lucretia sat quietly in a high-backed chair covered with velvet cushions in the divination room illuminated by dim candlelight. She couldn't focus while gazing at the crystal ball because the image of that afternoon from a century ago kept coming to mind. Our world is just a pile of extinguishing residual embers. The figure from the past had already blurred from her memory, but she could never forget what she heard from that depressed voice. Now, of course, she knew that her father had already been infected with madness at that time, that he would completely abandon his humanity shortly afterward and choose to actively embrace the blessing of subspace. Nevertheless, Lucretia still believed that if she had taken some time back in the day to speak to her father, then perhaps he might have chosen a different path instead of crossing the world's border. Maybe it's just a whimsical desire on her part, and perhaps the vanished being lost forever was a fact engraved in the annals of time. However, she still wants to know the truth of what happened back then. Lucretia, are you still listening? Tyrion's voice suddenly came from the crystal ball, which brought the lady back from the daze. Brother, she looked squarely at Tyrion in the crystal ball, her tone becoming a little serious. Do you remember what our father said before he last sailed to the border? That time he didn't let us follow. Of course I remember. Tyrion nodded. He said that he had found a clue to Anomaly 000, the cure for this world. He refused our request to follow and even ordered the other escorts at the time to turn back. That's the last time we saw the vanished in its normal form. Afterward, everything started to change. That's right, brother. All the crew members on the vanished stopped talking from that point forward as if cursed with the spell of silence. Father could still communicate with us, though, saying he did not find Anomaly 000 and that even if it did exist, the origin of the world's distortion isn't with it. The so-called cure that he sought never existed. This continued until the evening on the upper deck, where he revealed that the world was nothing more than a series of dying embers. Tyrion did not speak for a while. Then after an undetermined amount of silence, it was Lucretia who broke the awkwardness. After that, I specifically contacted the fleet of the churches patrolling near the border, including the Flame Bearers, the Storm Priests, the Scholars of the Truth Academy, and even the Gloomy Death Church. I asked them about Anomaly 000, but they all said that there couldn't be an anomaly or vision numbered 0. I also inquired about the matter too, Tyrion said in a deep voice, and got the same reply as you. There are no anomalies and visions numbered 0 in the world. Not that there are none, but that there are no corresponding vacancies at all in the list. Ads by PubFuture. Yes, the list that flowed out of the nameless king's tomb, the very list that held all the visions and anomalies of the world. If it says there are no vacancies for that spot, then there never will. That's why I said that father was probably already infected with madness before he left for the border. He couldn't have known about this information. Speaking of this, Tyrion suddenly stopped and eyed his sister through the crystal ball with a wary look. Why did you suddenly bring up this topic? We haven't talked about this for half a century. What are you planning to do? Don't worry, I won't plunge headlong into that magnificent wall of fog like our father did. Lucretia rarely showed emotions on her face, so the fact that she was smiling was something strange. I'm looking for clues left by our father, but I don't want to follow his old path. Tyrion fell silent for a moment and nodded slowly. That's good to hear. Now it was Lucretia who did not know how to continue the conversation, leaving the siblings staring off into the air for a relatively long and uncomfortable minute. This continued until a whistle from the sea mist suddenly blew from the outside, thus breaking the awkward atmosphere. Are you really going to plan? Because of the invitation from the administrator? Lucretia asks. The invitation is not important. I don't care about the safety of the city-state. However, the admin said in his letter that the vanished has reappeared in the real world. If true, I must go and investigate the matter in person, Tyrion said with a serious face. That ship has not been in the world for almost half a century. It worries me why it would reappear so suddenly. Lucretia thought for a moment and asked, you had an encounter with the vanished half a century ago, and I remember that you were still with the former Frost city-state. Was it really the vanished that you saw back then? It's true. Although it's difficult to believe, it's indeed the vanished, Tyrion said in a deep voice. I can still remember the exact location of each mast and the distribution of cables. Then, was it really our father who stood on the deck at that time? Tyrion lowered his head slightly, his face hidden by the shadows. It's him all right, even though I'd rather that thing not be him. Lucretia watched her brother through the crystal ball with hesitance and worry. Be careful. If it is really him, it will be very dangerous. I know, Tyrion sighed softly, that's not him anymore, but a crazy ghost corrupted by subspace. I won't take things lightly. Ads by PubFuture. Lucretia shook her head expressionlessly. No, I meant, if that's really our father, he will definitely get more ruthless in the beating after learning what you turned the sea mist into. Tyrion visibly widened his eyes in shock but quickly picked up on the meaning. Hey, what do you mean by that just now? This is the fruit of modernization. What's so bad about steam boilers and rapid-fire guns? Besides, how can you even mock me? Compared to the sea mist, which part of the bright star is still the same? The crystal ball blanked out at that part, leaving Lucretia the room to finally issue a soft sigh of relief as she got up from her chair. Big Brother is still so high-spirited. A little stimulation, and he's back to normal. It's good that he's keeping a strong interest in modern things, that will help maintain his soul and keep it from decaying. A series of light footsteps then came from a darker part of the room, accompanied by the friction of mechanical parts and the clockwork of something walking over. Lucretia followed the sound with her eyes until she eventually came face to face with a doll that was the same height as her own, the moving metal and ceramic joints slightly scary under the dim lighting. Mistress, please have some tea. The doll maid offered a teacup from the tray she was holding. Thank you. Lucretia took the teacup and asked casually, Looney, where are we now? The clockwork puppet, known as Looney, replied like a true maid with a curtsy bow, the bright star has just crossed the Cape Island, and is currently sailing on the edge of the eternal curtain. Do you want to enjoy the view from the window? Open the dome then. Lucretia took a sip of black tea and placed the cup back on the tray in Looney's hand. It's dawn. I should bask in the sun to help with my skin. Yes, mistress. Looney hung her head slightly and stepped backward. At the same time the words of this magical doll puppet spoke, a slight vibration started to take hold in the divination room. The creaking of mechanical devices sounded continuously, and the humming and crunching of the gears formed a sort of weird concerto in the air while things moved. First, the walls began to recede, followed by the blooming of the roof like a flower on stage. This was the upper deck of the Bright Star, where Lucretia the Sea Witch lives. From her post at the top, her view overlooked not only the sea but also the entire structure of her vessel that's been visibly split into two parts. The first half of the ship has been completely transformed with countless runes and magical creations making up its hull. Instead of calling this segment a ship, it's more suited to assume it's a beast reconstructed with magical materials and runes as its core. It's both grotesque and beautiful like an object from the legends. In the second half of the ship though, this was not so friendly looking. Its hull had been transformed into a ghostly translucent form, constantly shrouded in a veil of light. If perceived hard enough, one might even be able to make out its original appearance that's similar to another, a certain warship built a century ago by the name of the Vanished. Chapter 139 Inches The Frontier Keeper. A century ago, the Bright Star, like the Sea Mist, was an escort vessel of the Vanished. However, few people knew what happened to these two legendary warships after breaking away from the main flagship, nor the process of how they became what they are today. The Sea Mist, helmed by Steel Vice Admiral Tyrion, was once part of the naval fleet of the Frostbite city-state after many twists and turns. Back then, the people called it the unsinkable ship, or breathing wreckage. A well-deserved nickname of course. Not once, but many times did the ship suffer severe damage to its hull, yet it survived the ordeals like a cockroach after repeated overhauls that violated shipbuilding principles. Nowadays, it's better to call the Sea Mist a steel behemoth than a ship. In fact, the legends say the metal ship could even feed on its victims, absorbing the metal composites to grow its plated body and weaponry while no one was watching. As for the Bright Star, inherited by the younger sister Lucretia, also known as the Sea Witch, had a much more mysterious past. She doesn't interact with the civilized world at all. In fact, only a small number of members from the Explorers Association and patrolling church fleet would ever have the opportunity to encounter this witch. Now for those lucky enough to see the Bright Star in person, their description was as follows. It obviously doesn't belong to our real world anymore. The ship sank at least once in its lifetime and got partially taken by the boundless sea. Half of it is a ghost ship, the other remaining half a composite of distorted and magical items. There's no crew aboard either. They're all ghosts now, living only in name inside the clockwork puppets that runs the vessel. There is no doubt that the ship is a sailing corpse, or rather, a half-deformed corpse dragging half of its soul along. Lucretia's gaze slowly swept over her fine ship, slightly nodding only after being satisfied by what she saw. The Bright Star is in good condition, and her crew is happy. She knew about how the world viewed her precious vessel, and how the world saw her brother's Sea Mist. The lady also knew how the captains feared their entire family in fact. But she didn't care about it. There are few humans she had any connection with to begin with, and after so many years out on the sea alone, the experience of caring for the views of others had diminished to the point of non-importance. As for the ones that she does talk to from the Explorers Association, they're all level-headed veterans with plenty of experience in life. They know her and respected her for it. Simply said, she and her brother are still members of the mortal world, on humanity's side. Even if many of her kind thought differently, it won't change this fact. Besides, so what if they're cursed? There are too many things in this world that's cursed. What was an extra strange vessel or two going to matter? Slowly walking down from her mechanical flower, Lucretia was heading for the bow of the ship when a shrill voice caught her from the front. It's a ragdoll pushing aside two clockwork puppets that's busy cleaning the deck. Mistress, mistress, good morning, good morning. It's about to hit noon already, Lucretia said casually. Then she bypassed her companion and looked off into the distance where a magnificent wall of fog blocked her view. It's like staring into a giant screen at the edge of the world, both majestic and spectacular. Ads by PubFuture. That's the border. The magnificent divider had many names: World Border, the Great Mist, Mist Barrier, and its most formal name should be Eternal Curtain. But Lucretia prefers to call it the border. That's what her father used to call it. Under normal circumstances, this eternal curtain would not expand or shrink and covered all the known seas in the world like a fixed natural phenomenon. However, on rare occasions, part of the barrier would suddenly appear inside the territory of civilization. When this occurs, the outcome could only be described as a disaster. The reality in that area would collapse in on itself like a black hole, and all living matter dragged into the depths of the sea. In some instances, eyewitnesses even say they saw the door to subspace opening. They called this disaster the border collapse. For captains who often sailed the boundless sea, a collapsed border was a scarier thing than the turbulent storm. Thankfully, this doesn't happen often. Lucretia spent most of her time in the border area, observing it, studying it, and trying to summarize the fog's movement to find out why it would suddenly collapse inward, something her father had done 100 years earlier. But to this day, no one has been able to unravel the secret of this curtain. What did my father discover back then? What did he hear? What caused him to suddenly decide to enter the fog in search of no 0? Lucretia withdrew her gaze towards the border. In the borderlands, one mustn't stare at the eternal curtain for long. Although there was no clear evidence that the dense fog had the properties of devouring the mind and influencing one's thinking, there's an inherent risk of staring at anything for long out at sea, especially when one's far away from civilization. God knows what would spread as a result of the gaze here. Unexpectedly, a melodious whistle broke the calm in the waters here. Lucretia followed the sound and saw some tiny silhouettes appearing on the edge of the thick wall of fog. It wouldn't be long before they made contact with the bright star at the pace they're moving. It was 3 ships after their shapes came into view, the latest steel models powered by a surging and powerful steam core. A chance encounter and not an attack, since they sounded the horn, a sign of goodwill and a greeting to those sailing in these waters. Mistress, Looney walked over and spoke with a dull voice coming from inside the clockwork maid. It's the patrolling fleet of the church. Visual confirmation indicates they're part of the flame bearers. Only the flame bearers and the storm church would be so close to the eternal curtain while on patrol. Lucretia sighed softly. A bunch of crazy rash fellas. Do you wish to respond? Looney asked. Ads by PubFuture. Honk our horn, Lucretia said softly. Show them we're continuing the work of civilization. There were no customers in the antique shop today, except for a pair of unremarkable ornaments that were sold in the morning. No one has stepped into the store again. Nina was sitting at the counter with a textbook in hand and studying the subject of a mechanic. Meanwhile, Duncan had also been studying, curiously flipping through Nina's history textbook while casually making notes in his own notebook. This left only Shirley with nothing to do. She wanted to go home, but she didn't dare to go unless she offends the great shadow of subspace here. Then the girl tried to start up a conversation about the subject with Nina. Sadly, the illiterate girl didn't have a clue about the higher learning. For several times now, she's been pacing around in boredom. Is reading really that interesting? Of course it's interesting. Nina looked up, and the final exams are almost here. I have to hurry and review my books. Duncan also looked up at Shirley. If you're really bored, you can also find a book to read. I have a brief history of the city-state over here. Do you want to read it? Shirley glanced at the few books in Duncan's hand, dropped her mouth, then flushed away in embarrassment. I don't know how to read. Duncan suddenly froze to a standstill, his eyes widening like a disapproving parent. Why are you so surprised? Shirley looked at the uncle and niece pair like she's being judged for something beyond her means. Moping like a hurt child. I've never been to school, is that so strange? I've been raised by a dog. Duncan was indeed a little surprised, but after seeing Shirley's reaction, he sighed at how difficult life must have been for an orphan. You don't know how to read words, yet you can calmly blend into a school. I really don't know whether you're overconfident or too reliant in dogs' ability to interfere with a person's perception. Dogs' interference ability is very reliable. Shirley immediately defended, it's just. The girl's face had gotten slightly red again as she struggled to form a proper retort without offending the other party. Of course, Duncan wouldn't miss this improvement in their conversation and spoke with a smile. See, you're already getting better. You're even able to argue in front of me now. Is that so bad? That's right, see how kind my uncle is. Nina, a silly girl who didn't understand anything here, also chimed in to make things worse, although he used to be very irritable for a while, but he's much better now. Shirley opened her mouth and found herself not knowing how to communicate with the uncle and niece in front of her. Seeing this, Duncan merely shook his head with a pleasant smile, but just when he wanted to say something more, a slightly familiar aura had come into his perception. Duncan was slightly stunned by the signal, and in the next second, he could tell who this aura was coming from. Vanna, the young inquisitor is approaching this antique shop, and it's fast. Chapter 140 Inches 2 Guests. According to Duncan's perception, Vanna's aura was rapidly approaching the antique shop and in a weird zigzagging line. What is an inquisitor from the upper city suddenly running down to this antique shop in the lower city? And the trajectory is so eccentric. Duncan subconsciously glanced at the gothic girl sitting opposite of himself. Did she come for Shirley? The Storm Church finally discovered that there was a wild summoner hiding in the city. Or is she coming for me instead? But I've been very careful in my actions thus far. They shouldn't be able to trace the events back to me. If there's anything that might cause a leak, it would be this body's identity as a sun cultist. That shouldn't be enough to alarm an inquisitor to personally make the trip, right? Many theories fluctuated in the ghost captain's heart, causing him to stop reading and get up to the door. Mr. Duncan, something happened. Shirley was the first to notice the strange behavior and subconsciously asked. Stay in the shop. Duncan glanced at Shirley, then back at the door before peeking through the glass front window. Finally, he understood why Vanna's aura was approaching so quickly. She had driven here with a car. A dark gray car powered by a steam engine had parked outside his shop with two fine ladies stepping out of the vehicle. First was the tall and imposing Vanna, and second was Heidi the psychiatrist. Duncan. In that instant, Duncan realized he's been overthinking matters. This needs to be corrected immediately. Acting like an overly sensitive crackpot that's constantly worried about being caught was not a good thing. At the very least, not to this degree. Mr. Duncan. The doctor was the first to wave at the man peering out the shop window. The corners of Duncan's mouth visibly twitched after the neighbors all looked over his way. It's already quite eye-catching to have the Inquisitor visit his store. He doesn't need the locals to think he's two-timing both ladies or something along those lines. He quickly ran out and asked with an astonished face like he wasn't expecting them. Ah, you must have recognized her. There is no one in the city who doesn't know her. Let me introduce my friend, Miss Vanna Wayne. Heidi backhands her friend by the waist to push Vanna forward. Today is her off day. That's why she's here with me. After hearing about the event at the museum, she wanted to come in person and meet you as well. Friends. Duncan's surprise this time had a bit of realism, which he didn't expect to have. I really didn't expect that you would bring such a big person along. Calling me a big person is a bit of a stretch, Mr. Duncan. Vanna seemed to have been silently assessing the store owner when she finally spoke up, but for Duncan, this was not the first time he's heard her voice. Just treat me as a normal guest. As Heidi said, today is my off day, and I am here mainly to thank you for saving Heidi from the fire and to inquire about something. Don't worry. This is not a formal inquiry. Know something? The expression on Duncan's face didn't give off any change as he turned to one side and beckoned the two special guests inside. Then don't just stand there. Please come on in. Today the store is deserted, so it's great to have guests. Keep your cool, do not fret, Duncan whispers to Shirley, who was probing her head up from the table. Shirley blinked in confusion. Calm down. In the next second, she knew why she had to calm down. The young Inquisitor, the apex of power in the Church of Planned, had stepped into her view. She's a petite dwarf compared to Vanna, so the visual oppression wasn't just noticeable, it's enormous. Oh, wah, so tall. Shirley subconsciously blurted out these words. Vanna jerked to a halt, her eyes glancing at the petite girl with a strange expression as well. Hello. Her name is Shirley, Duncan said casually, she's helping out in my shop. Oh right, Miss Heidi might have mentioned this to you, but she was also at the museum when the fire broke out. Are you Shirley? Vanna connected the description from the report to the girl, she's indeed a cute little sister. Nina, who was reading a book next to the counter, had also heard the movement from her spot. First looking up in amazement at how tall Vanna was, then she quickly exclaimed after recognizing the female inquisitor. That's why I don't like going out with you, Heidi sighed and mumbled, you attract attention just by standing there. I'm the main show today, you know. But I don't want to attract attention like this either. Vanna shot a deadpan face to her friend like she was troubled, I've been trying to look as ordinary as I can today too. Forget it, I'm used to it. Heidi sighed even harder and turned to greet the girls with the gifts she had brought along. I don't know what you like, but I can't visit empty-handed, so these are my presents for the young ladies. My father also asked me to pass a gift from him to you as well, Mr. Duncan. He said you will like it since you're into history and the occult. You're too polite. What we did is no more than a helping hand. Duncan may say that, but his hands were far more honest in how quickly he accepted the gifts. However, as soon as he opened the box and saw the thing inside, he became puzzled. This is. It was a tome, beautifully bound like you see in those museums. Any scholar with an eye would know how valuable this must be based on the beautiful floral lettering, city-states and gods. This is a book from my father's collection. You will be hard-pressed to find a print like this in the market nowadays. The author is supposedly very famous from a century ago. I think the author was called Mr. Mardano Victor or something, Heidi said with a smile, and he likes to write about the history of various city-states and how the gods and church affected society during the ages. My father said you will definitely like this gift. Duncan silently studied the exquisite tome and gradually formed a smile. Indeed, he's very pleased by this gift. Of course, do give my thanks to Mr. Morris for his kindness. After some courteous formality and chit-chat, Duncan went ahead and directly closed shop for the day. Business has been slow anyways, so the man figured it's better to clear out the area to entertain his guests. While Nina brought 2 chairs out for the ladies, Duncan had started to brew the best coffee in his cabinet. As for Shirley, the nervous girl pretended to be busy sorting out the shelves to reduce her existence. Let's get straight to the point. I heard that you have been plagued by nightmares during this period. You're also often falling into a trance? Heidi asks after pulling out her med kit. Ah, it's actually not a nightmare. It's just a continuous strange dream. Nina didn't expect Miss Heidi to be so professional and so quickly. I always dream that I am standing in a very high place, like a tower, and then under my feet are several streets that have been burned to ash. Ah, but nothing terrible was in it though. Stop. Heidi gestured for a halt with her palm out. Then opening the medical box, she recited the key points. So recurring scenes, a high place, a fire, and no scary things. You're mentally exhausted because of the frequent dreaming, let me see. At first Nina didn't think much of the session, but after seeing the stuff inside Heidi's medical box, chisel, axe, saw, various potions, and sprays, her neck instantly shrunk back in fear. That, Miss Heidi, can I not treat it? In fact, I don't think I'm in that of a bad state. Duncan also saw the contents of Heidi's medical kit, which caused his eyebrows to jump. Forgive me, but is this really what is needed for a psychiatric treatment? The elegant and gentle-looking doctor in front of me is a psychiatrist or a veterinarian.